I'd like to take this opportunity first to thank all of you for joining us for our high holiday services. I know the past number of months have been challenging and difficult, but I do appreciate the great outpouring of support we've received during this time, and I wanted to share with you a few words on this new year, on this first day of Rosh Hashanah, 5781. And even though I'm standing in the sanctuary all alone, in my mind's eye, all of you are here with me today. The most important book of this past year does not involve President Trump. It does not touch upon the issue of racial injustice. It does not discuss police practices or any other touchstone issue of our present conversations. I would argue that the most important book of 2020 was written in 1350, nearly 7 centuries ago, and that book is Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. Decameron is one of those long classic books which you tell yourself you'll get around to reading, and you never do. But having actually read it this summer, you should. Decameron is a series of 100 tales, 10 sets of 10 stories, told by a group of 7 women and 3 men. And these artists fled Florence during the Black Plague, or sometimes called the bubonic plague of the mid-14th century. And historians believe that 60% of the population of Florence died as a result of that pandemic. Just imagine a group of writers from Greenwich Village at the beginning of COVID leaving New York City and writing for a while in the Catskills, and you'll have the idea of this undertaking. Decameron's tales were so important that they became the base of an online production of Cinetech Theater in Crystal City, Virginia. And as if that wasn't enough, they became the basis of an entire issue of the New York Times Sunday magazine, which solicited contributions from some of the nation's most prominent writers and assembled them in their own modern version. But if you really need proof, if you really want to assure yourself that Decameron is the most important book of 2020, you should know that there's a movie from Netflix about it called The Little Hours, starring Molly Shannon, Fred Armisen, and John C. Reilly. And yes, it's based on the Decameron. I guess even Netflix realized there's only so much Tiger King you could watch, and that you needed a little bit of variety. Characterizing the Decameron is not a simple matter. Some of its 100 tales are funny, others are serious. Some are tragic, others uplifting. But the framing of the tales is meant to signal to the reader what the overall theme is to be. If you can recall your high school days, Dickens begins Tale of Two Cities this way. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And what does he mean? He means that on the one hand, the French Revolution was about the highest ideals, liberty, fraternity, and brotherhood, but it was also marred by brutality and wanton violence. So how does Decameron frame itself? Let's listen to Boccaccio's opening sentence. Not as famous as Dickens, perhaps, but important nonetheless. To have compassion for those who suffer is a human quality which everyone should possess, especially those who have required comfort themselves in the past and have managed to find it in others. In other words, we need to have compassion ourselves because it is a certainty we have benefited from it when it was offered to us in our time of need by other people. Now in Hebrew, the word for compassion is what? The answer is rachamim, mercy, compassion. And I want to suggest several shades of meaning of this word rachamim to show that they encapsulate not only the spirit of Boccaccio's Decameron, but also that of Jewish tradition. First, we would do well to recall that the word rachamim is derived from the word rechem, meaning a womb. Just as the womb of the mother protects the unborn child, so compassion is a reflection of our deep-seated concern for Jewish life. In today's reading, we learn that Ishmael and his mother Hagar were sent into the wilderness when Ishmael's behavior posed a danger to Isaac. The Torah tells us that Ishmael was observed mitzachek. He was engaging in violence or perhaps sexual harassment. Yet at the point of death, an angel showed Hagar and Ishmael a well of water and rescued them. Indeed, we're told that ultimately they were permitted to return to Abraham's home, and Ishmael would become the father of a great nation because of his status as the son of Abraham. The God we worship is compassionate, meaning that above all else, he values the preservation of human life. Another use of the word compassion is found in the Talmud. And there we see an Aramaic term for the Torah, which is Rahmana, the merciful. The sense is that the Torah which God gave us is not only compassionate, is not only tempered by mercy, but is intended to be interpreted throughout the ages with humility and understanding. Everyone knows, or at least thinks they know, that any individual who commits suicide is not permitted to be interred in a Jewish cemetery. Doing so, of course, is a denial of the concept that God alone determines mi yichyeh mi yamut, right? Who's going to live and who's going to die. And we're not allowed to change that verdict by taking our own lives. And yet, writing in the late 18th century, the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, made committing suicide a virtual impossibility. And it is so that even in cases which clearly are suicides, and yes, I have come across a few over the years, are treated without differentiation from ordinary burials. Suicides are buried in Jewish cemeteries. They are eulogized. They are given the same shiva as any other death ever since that time, because this Torah is one of mercy. But there's one final meaning of rachem, which may not be obvious even to Hebrew speakers. We read in the Machzor the following phrase, Kerachem av al banim. God is merciful to his children as a father is compassionate toward his son. But rachem here might be based on the Aramaic, rachim. And rachim means to love, so kirachem av al banim could mean as a father loves his son. Compassion is an expression of parental love. And when we read the passage about Ephraim being my beloved son, it says, Rachem arachamenu ne'um Adonai. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'll have mercy. It could also mean, I'll indeed love Ephraim, says the Lord. That's a lot stronger declaration. Those three qualities, the affirmation of human life, the need for mercy, and the replacement of hatred and indifference with love, are the core of what is intended by compassion within the Jewish tradition. The central issue of this past year is pretty obvious. It's the staggering loss of life to COVID-19. As I read these words, we are approaching 200,000 deaths in the United States, 70 times the number of losses suffered on September the 11th. I consider myself far more fortunate than most these past several months. But there were private moments which were challenging and even heart-wrenching, and during which I myself struggled. When I watched the news and saw clips from New York area hospitals overrun by COVID deaths, they were hospitals whose halls I had walked hundreds and sometimes thousands of times. I watched as the Army Corps of Engineers was called in to create extra capacity in Mount Sinai Hospital, where my wife Phyllis was treated for cancer 6 years ago. I watched the ER of Long Island Jewish Hospital suffer the same fate. My son Ethan was born in LIJ 23 years ago. And I also, at times, was able to catch glimpses of North Shore University Hospital, where I visited patients each and every week for decades. And finally, I read articles in the newspaper about Parker Jewish Geriatric Center, and in the space of a few weeks, 57 seniors died of COVID. That's an institution where I was so regular during certain periods that the staff came to know me by name. All of this leads to a simple question. Are we committed to building a society based upon compassion, upon rachamim? Because one fact which was exposed during the course of these last few months, not for the first time, but certainly the most dramatically, was that we have not successfully built such a society. My middle son, Reuven, employed by the Department of Environmental Protection after receiving his master's degree, was deputized along with dozens of other young men and women to pack food trucks full-time, day after day, week after week, month after month, to assist indigent New Yorkers. I'm in awe of the work that Reuven did. But here's a simple question. How can there be such a staggering level of food insecurity in a city with the wealth of New York? Do you know that the most expensive real estate in Manhattan, the single most expensive apartment building in the city, has no full-time occupants? It is in fact used by vacationing Saudi oil sheiks and Russian oligarchs. Most nights if you walk by that building, it's dark. In a city with this level of wealth, we nevertheless have hundreds of thousands who don't have enough to eat. Similarly, you may have seen feeds from Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, which was overrun very badly during the early weeks of COVID. Elmhurst is a densely populated area of a very densely populated borough. It's home to nearly 90,000 people within an area a little more than 1 square mile. But do you know why Elmhurst Hospital is overrun? Because until 10 years ago, that area was served by several other hospitals, and they were forced to close their doors for financial reasons. The number one reason was that they provided care for the uninsured. And because they received no reimbursement, they ran untenable levels of debt. But we thought it's perfectly acceptable for people to lack basic health insurance, including many who work full-time. And the result was a death toll which was unprecedented. Sinai Chapels has prided themselves on timely burial in keeping with the Jewish faith. And yet the backlogs for funerals at Sinai Chapels were nearly 2 weeks at the height of COVID because they did not have enough limousine drivers. They could not obtain enough graves quickly enough to move any faster. I'm told that in minority neighborhoods the situation was even worse. And yet, until and unless we tackle the problem of health care, we are going to see this situation play out over and over and over again. One final observation. Even after COVID-19 ends, we are learning that there may be long-term medical consequences. This would naturally demand not only more nursing care, but also more home health aides. I served as rabbi of a senior congregation in Great Neck, New York, which is one of the wealthiest enclaves in the United States. I encountered home health aides, almost always people of color, whose devotion to their Jewish patients was extraordinary. But for all of the considerable personal sacrifices these individuals made, they were so poorly paid that few had cars. Do you know how hard it is to get around to your job in suburbia if you don't have an automobile? The answer is, it's a huge challenge. And again, these individuals are among the least likely, despite the health risks to themselves, to actually have health insurance. Are we prepared to ameliorate this situation? Or are we going to revisit the pain of the past? And so far, one has heard little about these unsung heroes or many others like them. How does this end? In Boccaccio's Decameron, we know the answer. The last set of 10 essays required all of the writers to produce tales which reflect nobility. And this completes Boccaccio's cycle He starts by saying that you have to be compassionate on the basis that others exhibited compassion toward you. But he ends by saying that if you don't fulfill that role, the cycle cannot go forward. How our story ends is still being written. Will we act with rachamim? Will we act in a way that affirms the centrality of life, that demands a society that is merciful, and that replaces baseless hatred with baseless love? Today we will look backward and we'll close the book on a difficult year. But looking ahead, we should remind ourselves that this is the day we get to start writing the new chapter. And my prayer above all is that as we've been beneficiaries of rachamim in the past, we'll redouble our efforts to do the same for others in the year 5781. Shana Tova.